An Apache warrior was left to die after losing his legs, but a white woman gave him a new life. The sun was beginning to set over the dry desert hills when the young Apache warrior, known as Chayton, found himself facing the greatest challenge of his life. He had been raised in the harsh wilderness of the American Southwest, trained from childhood to fight, survive, and honor his people. His tribe had always been proud of their warriors who were known for their courage and strength. Chayton had grown up hearing stories of great battles, of warriors who had gone into battle with the confidence that they would return victorious. But today Chayton's fate seemed to be sealed, and he had no one to blame but himself. It had all begun a few days earlier. The Apache had been engaged in a battle against a group of settlers who had been encroaching on their land. Chayton had joined a raiding party, leading the charge with his brothers in arms. His heart was full of pride, his mind focused on the mission. He was ready to defend his people at any cost, even if it meant giving his life for the land he had sworn to protect. The battle had been fierce, the air thick with smoke and dust, the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. Chayton had been at the front, charging forward, his rifle in hand, his heart pounding in his chest. But something had gone terribly wrong. In the heat of the battle, Chayton had found himself separated from the rest of his group. He had been surrounded by soldiers, their guns aimed at him, their faces cold and unfeeling. He had fought bravely, but the numbers were too great. His rifle had jammed, and in that moment of weakness, the soldiers had taken advantage. A bullet struck Chayton's leg, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his body like a lightning bolt. He gritted his teeth, trying to remain calm, but as he struggled to push himself up, another bullet found its mark, this time hitting his other leg. The pain was unbearable. His legs were now shattered beyond repair, and he could feel the blood pouring from the wounds. He could hear the soldiers approaching, their footsteps heavy in the sand. Chayton had always been taught to never show weakness, to never let his enemies see him falter. But as he lay there in the dirt, bleeding and helpless, he realized that there was nothing he could do to save himself. His life was slipping away with every passing second. The soldiers had left him for dead. They had no use for a wounded Apache warrior, and so they had moved on, leaving Chayton alone on the battlefield. He had tried to call out, but his voice was weak, barely a whisper in the wind. The last thing he saw before he closed his eyes was the sky above him, a canvas of orange and red as the sun set behind the hills. He knew that he might never see the stars again. Chayton lay there for what felt like an eternity. His body was cold, his blood soaking into the ground beneath him. His thoughts drifted, as if he were floating in the air above his own body. He thought of his people, of the warriors who had fought by his side, of the land they had sworn to protect. He thought of his family, who would never know what had happened to him. His heart ached with sorrow, but there was no one left to comfort him. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying with it the smell of smoke and death. Chayton felt his consciousness slipping away, his mind growing fuzzy. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if he was truly dying, but either way he felt the warmth of life slowly fading from his body. He had done his duty, fought bravely, and now there was nothing left but the emptiness of the desert, breath. It was in that moment, when Chayton thought all hope was lost, that he heard a faint sound. It was a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable, a woman's voice. At first, Chayton wasn't sure if he was imagining it. His mind clouded with pain and delirium. But then the sound came again, louder this time. It was a voice calling out to him. Slowly, through the haze of pain and exhaustion, Chayton managed to lift his head, his eyes blinking against the harsh sunlight. A figure appeared before him, a woman dressed in simple clothes, her face framed by long dark hair. She was walking toward him, her steps steady and determined. Chaitin could hardly believe his eyes. How could a woman be out here in the desert, so far from any settlement, alone and unafraid? And why would she approach him, an Apache warrior left to die? She stopped in front of him, kneeling down in the dirt. Chaitin tried to speak, but his voice failed him, barely more than a whisper. The woman's expression softened as she saw the extent of his injuries, her eyes full of pity and compassion. She reached out, touching his face gently, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Chaitin felt the warmth of another human being. "You're going to be all right," she said softly, her voice comforting in the midst of his pain.
"I'm going to help you."
Chaitin's mind was a blur. Breath. How could this woman help him? He was beyond saving. His legs were gone, and his life was slipping away. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she looked at him, that made him believe her words. The woman worked quickly, her hands moving with surprising skill as she tended to his wounds. She tore strips of cloth from her dress and used them to bandage his legs, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Chaitin winced with pain, but he didn't protest. He had no strength left to fight. When she finished, she looked up at him with a calm expression.
"I'll take you to my home," she said.
"I'll get you the help you need."
Proud in dispatch. Chaitin didn't know who this woman was or why she had chosen to help him, but in that moment, as he lay on the ground, surrounded by the desert and the fading light of day, he knew one thing for sure. He had been given a chance, a second chance at life. And it was all because of this woman, this stranger who had shown him kindness when the world had abandoned him. As she carefully lifted him into her arms, Chaitin couldn't help but wonder what kind of future lay ahead. He had been left for dead, but now, against all odds, he was alive. And this woman, this white woman who had saved him, would be the one to change everything. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as the woman whose name was Sarah carefully carried Chaitin in her arms. She was a settler living far from any nearby town, with only the vast desert as her neighbor. Bays. Sarah had grown up on a small farm with her family, and though she had never been taught to fear the Apache, most people in her community did. She had heard the stories of raids, of battles, of fierce warriors who fought to protect their land. But Sarah was different. She was kind-hearted and believed that everyone deserved compassion, no matter who they were or where they came from. That's why, when she had found Chaitin lying on the ground, alone and injured, she hadn't hesitated to help. As Sarah walked through the desert with the warrior in her arms, she didn't know what lay ahead. Her husband had warned her about the dangers of helping someone from the Apache tribe.
They were often seen as enemies, their actions misunderstood by the settlers.
But Sarah's heart told her otherwise. She couldn't just leave a man to die. She had to do something. Chaitin, though weakened and in pain, found a strange comfort in Sarah's arms. Her steady pace, her soft murmurs as she tried to reassure him. It all brought a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. His head rested against her chest, and he could hear her heart beating, steady and calm. It was a sound that soothed him, a sound that told him he wasn't entirely alone in the world. He had been through so much, lost everything he had known, his tribe, his home, his strength. But as Sarah carried him, he began to wonder if there was a chance, a small flicker of hope, that he could rebuild his life. And despite the agony in his legs, he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that there might be a future beyond the battlefield. When they finally arrived at her small cabin, Sarah carefully laid Chaitin down on a cot near the fire. The room was simple, with wooden walls and a small hearth crackling in the corner. The smell of burning wood filled the air, mixing with the scent of the wildflowers Sarah often picked when she had time. The cabin, though modest, was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. Sarah quickly gathered what she needed. Round. She didn't have much, just some bandages, a few herbs, and water. She had learned some basic medicine from her mother, who had cared for sick animals and neighbors when Sarah was a child. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She wasn't sure how she would manage the situation, but she wasn't about to give up. Chayton looked around the cabin, his eyes blurry with pain, but there was something comforting about the simple surroundings. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars and pots, the wood darkened with age, but it was the fire in the hearth that caught his attention. The warmth from the flames spread throughout the room, and for the first time in days he felt something other than cold and fear. As Sarah worked quickly, she noticed how quiet Chayton had become. His dark eyes followed her every movement, watching her with a kind of curiosity. She had never helped an Apache before, and she didn't know if he saw her as an ally or an enemy, but she hoped that, in time, he would come to trust her. She sat beside him, taking his injured legs into her hands. The sight of his wounds was enough to make her stomach turn. She had never seen someone so badly hurt, but she didn't allow herself to feel fear. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. With steady hands, she began to clean his wounds, murmuring soft words of comfort as she worked. Chayton flinched as she touched the wounds, but he didn't pull away. He had no strength to protest. He simply watched her, her face filled with determination. "I know it hurts," Sarah said softly, looking up at him. "But it'll get better. I'll take care of you."
Chayton didn't speak, but he could feel the sincerity in her voice.
There was no judgment in her eyes, no fear, just kindness. It was a rarity in his world, where hostility was often the only currency. He had been taught to see the world as a place of constant struggle, where enemies were everywhere, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But here, in this small cabin, he was starting to wonder if there was another way to live. Once she had cleaned his wounds, Sarah moved to his side. She brought over some water and helped him drink, her hands gentle as they guided the cup to his lips. Chayton drank slowly, savoring the coolness of the water, the simple pleasure of something so essential yet so scarce in the desert. Afterwards, Sarah wrapped his legs with the bandages she had made. They weren't perfect, but they were enough to stop the bleeding and offer some protection. She then covered him with a blanket, making sure he was comfortable before sitting down beside him.
I'll stay here with you tonight, Sarah said.
"You rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." Chayton closed his eyes, exhausted but unable to sleep. The pain in his legs was unbearable, but it was the other pain, the emotional wound of betrayal, that was harder to bear.
How could his own people leave him behind? He had always been taught that the tribe was family, that they would always fight for each other.
But in his moment of greatest need, they had abandoned him. And yet, this woman, this stranger, someone from the very world that had been his enemy, had taken him in without hesitation. She didn't see him as a threat. She didn't fear him. Instead, she had cared for him, treated him as a human being in need, not as an Apache warrior to be feared or killed. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, and the shadows on the walls danced as if they were alive. Chayton turned his head slightly to watch, his thoughts a swirl of confusion and wonder. Could this be real? Could there be hope for a life beyond the violence, beyond the hatred he had always known?
As he lay there, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, Sarah sat by the fire, sewing a torn piece of fabric.
Broadus. She worked quietly, her movements slow and steady, her mind focused, but every now and then she would glance at Chayton, her gaze soft. She had no idea what the future held, but she was determined to help this man, to offer him a second chance. She had seen too much suffering in the world, too much hate. If she could change one life, perhaps she could make a difference. Chaitan's eyes slowly closed, and for the first time in days he allowed himself to rest. His body was still in pain, his future uncertain. But for now, he was safe.
And that was more than he could have ever hoped for when he had first been left to die in the desert.
Break him. As sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of his people, of his tribe, of the land they had fought to protect. And in that dream he saw Sarah standing beside him, not as an enemy, but as an ally. It was a new vision, one that he had never imagined possible, but it was one he would hold on to, no matter what the future brought. Days turned into weeks as Chaitan remained in Sarah's cabin, and with each passing day he felt his body growing stronger. The pain in his legs, though still present, was no longer the constant ache it had been when Sarah first found him. The bandages, though simple, had done their job, and the swelling had started to go down. Indefiniteness passed, Dravens passed every moment tending to him. And as the days passed, Chaitan found himself looking forward to her visits, her kind touch, and her steady voice that always seemed to reassure him. Desperate was dedicated to his recovery, and even though she had limited resources, she found ways to help him. She used herbs and plants from the desert to make teas that eased his pain, and she would bring him fresh water from the nearby stream. Every day she would check on him, changing his bandages and making sure that his wounds didn't become infected. It wasn't easy, but she did it with patience and care, never once complaining. Chaitan was still weak, unable to walk or stand on his own, but he could feel his strength returning. There was a sense of calm in the cabin, a peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The violence of the battlefield, the chaos of war. It all seemed so far away now. The sound of the wind through the trees, the warmth of the fire, and Sarah's gentle presence filled the space in a way that made him feel safe, something he hadn't felt in years. Brask. Sarah, for her part, was quietly amazed at how quickly Chaitan was recovering. She had expected a much slower process, but his body seemed to be responding well to the care she was giving him. There were still moments when he would wake in the night, sweating and restless from nightmares, but Sarah would always be there to comfort him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering words of reassurance. It was during one of those quiet nights that Chaitan finally spoke. The nightmares had shaken him awake, and as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sarah sat beside him, waiting for him to open up. She had noticed the shadows in his eyes, the quiet pain that lingered even after his physical wounds had started to heal. "Why do you help me?" Chaitan's voice was hoarse, as if the question itself was a heavy burden. Sarah paused, surprised by the question. Bo. She had never really thought of it that way. She had simply done what seemed right to her, without questioning it. But now, as she sat there in the stillness of the room, she realized that she had never really explained herself to him.
"I help you because I believe everyone deserves a chance," she said softly, her voice steady.
It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. You're a person, Chaitan, and you deserve to live. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and Chaitan turned his head slightly to look at her. For a long time, he had seen the world as a place of endless struggle, where survival came at the cost of others. He had been taught that only the strong survived, that loyalty to one's people was all that mattered. But here, with Sarah, he was learning something new, a different way to see the world. "Thus, I've never met anyone like you," Chaitan said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and confusion. "Your people, they see us as enemies." Bast. She had heard the stories, too. The stories of raids, of bloodshed, and of the fierce battles between the settlers and the Apache. She understood why people feared the Apache, but she also knew that fear was often based on misunderstanding.
I know.
she said. But that doesn't mean I should treat you as an enemy.
Breath. Everyone has their story, Chaitan. And your story, it's more than what I've heard. For the first time since he had arrived at her cabin, Chaitan felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Hope. The thought that there was someone who saw him for who he truly was, not just as a warrior or a symbol of his people, but as a man with a story, a person with feelings. It was a foreign concept, but it was also something that gave him a sense of peace. The next few days were filled with small steps of progress. Sarah had set up a simple exercise routine for Chaitan, helping him to move his arms and upper body, trying to keep his muscles from atrophying. She didn't know if he would ever be able to walk again, but she was determined to help him regain his strength.
Every morning they would sit together in front of the fire and she would guide him through exercises, her words encouraging him to keep going even when it was hard.
Chaitan didn't know what the future held, but he was learning to trust Sarah. She had become more than just a healer to him. She had become a friend, someone who genuinely cared for him and wanted to help him rebuild his life. He had no idea where that journey would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to take that first step.
One afternoon, as Sarah helped Chaitan sit up on the cot, he asked her a question that had been on his mind for some time.
Why do you live here, alone in this cabin? Don't you miss the company of others? Sarah smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. But she hadn't thought much about her solitude in years. But now, as she looked at Chaitan, she realized how much her life had changed since her husband had passed away. Desk. She had chosen to live in isolation, finding peace in the quiet of the desert, away from the bustling towns and the noise of everyday life. But now, with Chaitan's presence in her cabin, she was starting to see things differently.
I lived with my husband here for many years, Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with both sadness and fondness.
But he passed away a year ago. Since then, I've been alone.
But I don't mind it. I like the quiet. It gives me time to think, to reflect. Chaitan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He too had known loss that had shaped him into the man he was today. And now here he was, in a cabin with a woman who had lost someone close to her, yet who still found the strength to help a stranger like him. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. Sarah looked out the window, her gaze distant as she considered the question. Base, sometimes. But I feel like I'm needed here, she said, after a moment. Maybe not by many people, but by you, at least. And maybe that's enough. Chaitan was quiet, thinking about what she had said. He had never thought about life that way, about being needed, about finding purpose in small moments. But as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and Sarah's quiet presence, he realized that perhaps, just maybe, he was starting to find his own purpose again.
The days turned into weeks, and Chaitan continued to recover.
But his body was still weak, but his spirit was growing stronger each day.
Sarah had helped him not only with his physical recovery, but with something deeper. She had shown him that there was more to life than survival, that there was kindness in the world, even for someone like him.
Chaitan didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the man he had been when Sarah found him lying in the desert. He had been given a second chance. And with that chance came the possibility of a life beyond war, beyond bloodshed, and beyond the world he had once known. And as the days passed, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a new purpose, one that was rooted in peace, in healing, and in the unexpected friendship of a woman who had shown him what it truly meant to live. The days in Sarah's cabin had passed slowly but steadily, and Chaitan had made remarkable progress. His legs, though still not fully healed, had become stronger thanks to the care Sarah had given him. His body was regaining some of its former strength, and though he still couldn't walk without help, he was no longer confined to his bed, He had become more independent, able to sit up on his own, and sometimes even stand with the support of crutches Sarah had fashioned for him. But the time had come. Chayton knew it was time to return to his people, to his tribe. The decision had been weighing heavily on his heart. While Sarah's home had become a place of healing and comfort, it was not his place. His tribe, the Apache, were his family, and he knew that they would be searching for him, wondering what had happened to the warrior who had been left behind. His absence had been felt, and now he needed to face his people, to prove to himself and to them that he had not given up, that he was still a warrior in spirit, even if his body had been broken. Sarah understood his decision, though it pained her. She had grown to care deeply for Chayton, and the thought of him leaving filled her with a sense of loss. But she knew that his journey was not her journey to make. She had helped him survive, and now it was time for him to find his own path, one that would lead him back to where he belonged. As the sun rose one cool morning, Sarah prepared Chayton for his departure. Apache had made him a simple bundle of supplies, food, water, and a few other necessities to help him on his journey. The cabin had become a home, a place of healing and refuge, but it was time to let go. Chayton had become strong, and now he had to face the world once again, a world that was both familiar and strange. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice soft and filled with concern as she adjusted the straps on his crutches. Chayton nodded, his face serious but calm. "I have to go back. I can't stay here forever. I have a duty to my people."
Sarah stood silently for a moment, then stepped forward, her hand resting gently on his shoulder.
"But promise me you won't forget what you've learned here. You're not the same man you were when you first arrived." Chayton looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. A small, quiet smile that held a deep sense of gratitude. "I will never forget. You saved my life, Sarah. You showed me kindness when I had nothing left. I'll carry that with me." The words hung between them for a moment, but she held back her tears. She had helped him heal, but she also knew that she had to let him go. But it was a part of life, a part of their shared journey. With a deep breath, Chayton carefully stood, leaning on the crutches Sarah had made for him. He had spent hours practicing with them, learning to balance himself and move without falling. It wasn't easy, but he was determined. His legs still hurt, and he knew he would never walk the same way again, but he had learned to accept this new reality. "Thank you, Sarah," Chayton said, his voice thick with emotion.
I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done. Sarah smiled softly, her heart full. Just take care of yourself, Chayton.
That's all I ask. With that, Chayton began his journey. As he moved away from the cabin and into the open desert, he felt a mix of emotions. His heart was heavy, but it was also lighter than it had been in a long time. The weight of his past, of the battles, the loss, the pain, was still with him, but he no longer felt completely burdened by it. He had a new understanding of life, a new perspective that Sarah had helped him find. The journey was long, and though Chayton moved slowly, he was determined. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but it no longer seemed as hostile as it once had. The hot sun beat down on his back, but he didn't mind. He was used to the heat. His body was stronger now, and with every step, he felt the distance between himself and the past growing wider. After several days of traveling, Chayton finally arrived at the edge of his tribe's territory. He knew that it would be difficult to return. He had been abandoned by his people once before, and he feared that they would see him as weak, as no longer fit to be a warrior. But he had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. As he approached the camp, he saw familiar faces. His fellow warriors, the elders, the women and children, they were all there, gathered around the fire, talking quietly among themselves, breaths. When they saw him, there was a moment of silence. Chayton's heart raced as they all turned to look at him, their eyes filled with curiosity, suspicion, and perhaps even judgment. Thespe, one of the elders, a man named Tahoma, stood up and stepped forward. He was an older man, with a long white beard and deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, and Chayton could see the wisdom in them. But there was also something else, something that Chayton couldn't quite place. "Bray."
Chayton, Tahama said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We thought you were lost."
"We thought you were dead." Chayton lowered his gaze for a moment, the weight of his feelings settling over him. Breath. "I was left behind," he said quietly. "But I survived. I've learned something new." The others watched in silence as Tahoma stepped closer, his eyes searching Chayton's face. "You've returned to us, but you are not the same man who left. You've lost much, and you have gained much."
Chayton nodded. "I have lost my legs, but I have gained something else."
"I have gained understanding." Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly.
"You are welcome here, Chayton. You have not come back as a broken warrior. You have come back as a man who has learned to live again." With those words, Chayton felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had feared that his people would reject him, that they would see him as a failure. But here, in the presence of the elder and his tribe, he realized that his survival wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. The story had changed, and so had his place within his people. In the following days, Chayton was welcomed back into the tribe. Though his legs were still a reminder of the pain he had endured, they no longer defined him. He was not the warrior who had once fought on the battlefield, but he was still a part of his tribe, still a part of the family that had always been there for him, even when it seemed like he had been left behind. He shared the story of his survival with the tribe, telling them of the woman who had saved him, of Sarah, the kind-hearted settler who had shown him compassion when he had nothing left. The tribe listened with respect, and Chayton's story became one of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always the possibility of healing and change. As time passed, Chayton became a wise elder in his own right, a man who had learned to live beyond the battlefield, beyond the violence and the pain. He taught the younger warriors the value of peace, of understanding, and of compassion. He had become a bridge between two worlds, the world of his people and the world of the woman who had saved him. And in that journey, Chayton found a new purpose, not as a warrior, but as a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest battles were the ones fought within. The days following Chayton's return to his tribe were filled with change. Breaths. His presence was no longer met with uncertainty or judgment. Instead, he was seen with new eyes, not as the broken warrior who had been left behind, but as a man who had found a new path. In the eyes of his people, Chayton had proven that even in the face of loss and hardship, there was always a chance for growth. And his story, his survival, became an inspiration to all who heard it. As he settled into his new life, Chayton felt the weight of his past slowly lifting from his shoulders. He no longer carried the burden of anger or shame that had once defined him. Instead, he found peace in the knowledge that he was still part of his tribe, still part of the world he had once feared he'd lost forever. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle above, Chayton would sit by the fire with the other elders, telling stories of his survival. He spoke of Sarah, the white woman who had saved him, who had shown him a kindness that had changed the course of his life. The younger warriors listened intently, captivated by the idea of a woman from another world offering compassion to one of their own. Chaitan's words spread through the camp, and soon everyone knew the tale of the Apache warrior who had been given a second chance by a woman from beyond their lands. Chaitan's story became more than just a personal tale. It became a symbol. It represented the possibility of change, of finding light in the darkest of times. And as the years passed, his legacy grew.
He was no longer just a warrior. He was a teacher, a guide for those who needed wisdom and understanding.
He spoke of the importance of compassion, of the power of kindness in a world that often seemed consumed by violence and fear.
But Chaitan's teachings didn't stop there. He became a bridge between his tribe and the outside world, the world that had once seemed so foreign and hostile. He spoke of Sarah often, and in doing so he helped his people understand that not everyone was an enemy. He encouraged them to seek peace, to find common ground even with those who had once been their adversaries. His words were not always easy to hear, but they were important. Chaitan had learned that survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to change. One day, as he sat by the fire with a group of young warriors, one of them asked him a question that had been on their minds for some time. "Chaitan, do you ever regret going to her, to the white woman who saved you?" The young warrior asked. "Do you think we could ever have peace with people like her?" Chaitan thought for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the silence. His gaze drifted toward the stars, his mind wandering back to that moment in the desert when Sarah had found him, when her hands had touched his face and her voice had whispered words of comfort. He thought of the days he had spent in her care, the healing she had provided, not just to his body but to his spirit. And then he turned his eyes back to the young warrior. "No," Chaitan said softly. "I do not regret it. In fact, I believe that without her, I would not be here today. Sarah showed me that kindness and understanding are more powerful than hate. And as for peace, yes, I believe it is possible. We are all human. We all suffer, we all feel pain. And if we can find a way to understand each other, there is always hope for peace." The young warrior nodded thoughtfully, but the others around the fire were silent, their faces filled with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. Chaitan knew that his words would not change everything overnight. The path to peace was not an easy one, and many of the tribes still carried the scars of past battles. But Chaitan had faith that his message would one day take root. It was a slow process, but he believed in it. He believed that the future could be different. As the years went on, Chaitan became more than just an elder in his tribe. He became a respected figure, a symbol of resilience and hope. His life had not turned out the way he had once imagined. He had lost his legs, and he had lost much of what he had once known. But in return, he had gained something far more valuable, a new perspective on life, and the understanding that strength was not just about physical power, but about the ability to adapt, to learn, and to grow. In his later years, Chaitan began to pass on his wisdom to the next generation of warriors. He taught them not only how to fight, but how to survive with honor, how to find peace in a world that seemed filled with conflict. He spoke to them of Sarah, the woman who had given him a new life, and he encouraged them to look beyond their enemies, to see the humanity in others, no matter their background or appearance. Chaitan's legacy became one of peace and understanding, a legacy that would outlive him, that would continue to inspire those who came after him. His name was spoken with respect not just by the Apache, but by those who had once considered him an enemy. In the end, Chaitan had become more than just a warrior. He had become a teacher, a healer, and a symbol of hope. As the years passed, Chayton grew old. His body, though scarred and worn, remained strong, and his spirit remained unbroken. He lived out his days in peace, surrounded by his people, knowing that he had left a lasting mark on the world. And when the time came for him to pass on, he did so quietly, content in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his purpose. In his final days as he lay in his bed, he thought of Sarah once again. He thought of the woman who had saved him, who had given him the chance to live a life he never thought possible. And in that moment he realized that he had given her a gift as well, the gift of understanding, of showing her people that not all Apache warriors were enemies, that there was another way to live. Chayton's story lived on, passed down through the generations, not just as a tale of survival, but as a story of transformation. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, and that sometimes the greatest strength came not from fighting but from learning to live in a way that honored both the past and the future. His legacy was one of peace, compassion, and understanding, values that would continue to guide the Apache people for generations to come.